Book 3, The Professor, Section 1 of The Professor's House by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 3, The Professor, Section 1. All the most important things in his life, St. Peter sometimes reflected, had been determined by chance. His education in France had been an accident. His married life had been happy largely through a circumstance with which neither he nor his wife had anything to do. They had been young people with good qualities and very much in love, but they could not have been happy if Lillian had not inherited a small income from her father, only about 1,600 a year, but it had made all the difference in the world. A few memorable interregnums between servants had let him know that Lillian couldn't pinch and be shabby and do housework, as the wives of some of his colleagues did. Under such conditions she became another person, and a bitter one. Tom Outland had been a stroke of chance he couldn't possibly have imagined. His strange coming, his strange story, his devotion, his early death and posthumous fame, it was all fantastic. Fantastic, too, that this tramp boy should amass a fortune for someone whose name he had never heard, for an extravagant and wheeling stranger. The professor often thought of that curiously bitter burst from the baritone in Brahms' Requiem, attending the words, "He heapeth up riches and cannot tell who shall scatter them." The vehemence of this passage had seemed to him uncalled for until he read it by the light of the history of his own family. St. Peter thought he had fared well with fate. He wouldn't choose to live his life over. He might not have such good luck again. He had had 2 romances, one of the heart, which had filled his life for many years, and a second of the mind, of the imagination. Just when the morning brightness of the world was wearing off for him, along came Outland and brought him a kind of second youth. Through Outland's studies, long after they had ceased to be pupil and master, he had been able to experience afresh things that had grown dull with use. The boy's mind had the superabundance of heat which is always present where there is rich germination. To share his thoughts was to see old perspectives transformed by new effects of light. If the last 4 volumes of The Spanish Adventurers were more simple and inevitable than those that went before, it was largely because of Outland. When St. Peter first began his work, he realized that his great drawback was the lack of early association, the fact that he had not spent his youth in the great dazzling southwest country, which was the scene of his explorers' adventures. By the time he had got as far as the 3rd volume, into his house walked a boy who had grown up there, a boy with imagination, with the training and insight resulting from a very curious experience, who had in his pocket the secrets which old trails and stones and watercourses tell only to adolescents. 2 years after Tom's graduation, they took the copy of Fray Garces' manuscript that the professor had made from the original in Spain, and went down into the southwest together. By autumn they had been over every mile of his trail on horseback. Tom could take a sentence from Garces' diary and find the exact spot at which the missionary crossed the Rio Colorado on a certain Sunday in 1775. Given one pueblo, he could always find the route by which the priest had reached the next. It was on that trip that they went to Tom's Blue Mesa, climbed the ladder of spliced pine trees to the Cliff City and up to the Eagle's Nest. There they took Tom's diary from the stone cupboard, where he had sealed it up years ago, before he set out for Washington on his fruitless errand. The next summer Tom went with the professor to Old Mexico. They had planned a 3rd summer together in Paris, but it never came off. Outland was delayed by the formalities of securing his patent, and then came August 1914. Father Duchesne, the missionary priest who had been Tom's teacher, stopped in Hamilton on his way back to Belgium, hurrying home to serve in any capacity he might. The rugged old man stayed in Hamilton only 4 days, but in that time Outland made up his mind, had a will drawn, packed, and said goodbye. He sailed with Father Duchesne on the Rochambeau. To this day, St. Peter regretted that he had never got that vacation in Paris with Tom Outland. He had wanted to revisit certain spots with him, to go with him some autumn morning to the Luxembourg Gardens, when the yellow horse-chestnuts were bright and bitter after rain, to stand with him before the monument to Delacroix and watch the sun gleam on the bronze figures, Time bearing away the youth who was struggling to snatch his palm, or was it to lay a palm? Not that it mattered. It might have mattered to Tom had not chance in one great catastrophe swept away all youth and all palms, and almost time itself. And suppose Tom had been more prudent, and had not gone away with his old teacher? St. Peter sometimes wondered what would have happened to him once the trap of worldly success had been sprung on him. He couldn't see Tom building Outland or becoming a public-spirited citizen of Hamilton. What change would have come in his blue eye, in his fine long hand with the back-springing thumb, which had never handled things that were not the symbols of ideas? A hand like that, had he lived, must have been put to other uses. His fellow scientists, his wife, the town and state would have required many duties of it. It would have had to write thousands of useless letters, frame thousands of false excuses. It would have had to manage a great deal of money, to be the instrument of a woman who would grow always more exacting. He had escaped all that. He had made something new in the world, and the rewards, the meaningless conventional gestures, he had left to others. End of Book 3, The Professor, Section 1.